Thank you. I have to thank you for this wonderful introduction. I am not an assistant professor, I'm a researcher at Stockholm University. So you gave me too much credit, I guess. But anyway, thank you for having me. It's great to be here in this beautiful city. The overall theme for the 3 lectures that I have planned for today focus on the epistemology of dark matter research. And that can be sort of broken down there's sort of 2 ways of approaching this. One is, well, what are the epistemological foundations or underpinnings of different aspects of dark matter research? So in other words, like, what is the kind of knowledge that scientists can gain from dark matter research, from different kinds of dark matter research? And what is it about the research that permits them to gain this kind of knowledge, right? The second sort of way of approaching epistemology of dark matter research is thinking about what can dark matter research teach us about ongoing debates in philosophy of science, right? This is sort of a new area, or like relatively new compared to a lot of topics that philosophers of science tend to discuss. And so it's kind of interesting to see, like, when we look at the practice of dark matter research, does it tell us something new about ongoing debates, for instance, about philosophy of experiment or philosophy of computer simulations? And so the 3 lectures that I've planned will do a little bit of both. And so before I dive into the first lecture, I want to give you a little bit of an overview. Does this not work? Okay. Does this not work either? There we go. So today, in the first lecture, because I'm speaking twice today, in the first lecture, I plan to discuss a little bit the topic of the dark matter and MOND debate. From what I gather, Niels has already talked about this yesterday and has hopefully gotten you a little bit up to speed about this. What I will do in this first lecture is to give you an assessment of some of the arguments that defenders of MOND tend to give in the philosophical literature. The too long don't read, or don't attend, I guess, of this lecture is that the epistemological arguments offered by defenders of MOND fail to show that MOND is epistemically preferable over dark matter. And so as part of this lecture, I'm going to give you sort of an overview of some of these arguments, but then I'll also talk a little bit about theory confirmation and how we can learn something about particular views about theory confirmation from this particular debate in science. In the second lecture, I'm going to talk about, so the second and the third lecture will focus squarely on the epistemology of dark matter research. So I'm going to leave MOND behind and just focus on dark matter research. In the second lecture, I'm going to focus on the observational side, talking about dark matter observations and experiments. And then, so that's for later today. And then in the third lecture, I'm going to talk about the epistemology of dark matter simulations and computer simulations, right? In the last 5 years or so, I think a lot of interesting work has been done in epistemology of computer simulations that draws on cosmological and astrophysical simulations. And so that's what I will talk a little bit about in the third lecture. So that's sort of my plan for the 3 lectures that I plan to give. I'm going to now do shameless promotion. So I just wanted to highlight to you all that I am the co-editor of an edited volume in philosophy of astrophysics. It's the first book or volume that's bringing together a number of works by a number of up and coming and leading scholars in philosophy of astrophysics, including Niels. And there's a significant section of the book that's actually dedicated to philosophy of simulations and to philosophy of observational astrophysics and experimental astrophysics. So stay tuned for when it will arrive, likely this summer. We'll see. So let's start with this first lecture. So the epistemology of the dark matter and MOND debate. Now, the scientists in the room may be, why is another philosopher talking about MOND, right? And that's a fair enough question. And I guess I should say that this talk is actually primarily aimed towards a philosophical audience, and it'll be clear in a moment why that is the case. in context of a summer school, right? The summer school is about the philosophy of dark matter. And I think, as Niels has indicated from what I gathered from what people told me, the literature in philosophy of dark matter is fairly young, but somebody protest? No, sorry. Maybe it's not that young. No, I'm kidding. But so the philosophy of dark matter is, in fact, I'm going to stick to my guns, fairly young. But if you look at that literature, actually, you'll notice that one particular debate is front and center, and that is the dark matter and MOND debate. And so if you're at a summer school on philosophy of dark matter, it's good to get some ideas about what this literature has looked like in the past, right? And so here's a sampling of some of the papers and indeed the books that actually have appeared on this topic. And this is nowhere near exhaustive. There's much more. And what's interesting is that if you read these papers, if you read some of these papers, you get the impression that there is a genuine underdetermination in astrophysics and cosmology between fundamentally incompatible hypotheses. The dark matter hypothesis on the one hand and the MOND hypothesis on the other. Some of the papers that I've listed here, for instance, by Michela Massimi and by Melissa Jacart, take more or less a neutral stance in the debate and are focused on the conceptual foundations of it. Actually, I now realize that I forgot Niels's papers on this, on the conceptual distinction between dark matter and MOND, which he wrote with Dennis Leemkuhl. And so those are more focused on analyzing either the conceptual foundations of the debate or of the two theories, right? Sort of this philosophical neutral analysis. But the majority of the recent papers in the literature, for instance, by McGaw, by David Merritt, and Bob Sanders, who's also not on here, Mordechai Milgram as well, authors who themselves are actively researching MOND, they actually make an explicit defense of MOND in favor of dark matter. So they're defending MOND over dark matter, right? And as you may have noticed from the journals in which these papers appear, and the fact that I've mentioned that they appear in philosophical literature, is these kinds of defenses very much take a philosophical turn, right? They're very much focused on using philosophy of science to argue that MOND is a better theory than dark matter, or a better hypothesis. Now, what you probably also are a little bit aware of is that this controversy between MOND and dark matter, it's front and center in philosophy of science, but it's, and I hope the physicists will agree with this, it is almost completely absent in the physics literature, right? In the scientific debate, if you read the current literature in astrophysics and cosmology, it is dark matter is by far the established view and the established theory, and the MOND is not really part of it. That's also, I think, maybe why the topic of the summer school is philosophy of dark matter and not philosophy of dark matter and MOND, right? So we get this sort of weird discrepancy. And so we get this weird discrepancy between the philosophical literature and the scientific literature. And so there's a few interesting questions that can be asked, about the debate, right? Some of these questions are more of the conceptual kind. For instance, are these two hypotheses really as distinct as is often portrayed, or is there some ambiguity there? I think Niels will talk a little bit about this, right? There's also the question of well, what is the disagreement about? Is it about models? Is it about theories? And to what extent is that relevant to how we assess the debate? There's also questions about what factors do sociological roles play in this debate. So there's interesting questions from sociology of science. But the question that I want to focus on is more of an epistemic nature. And so it's the epistemic dimension of the debate. And sorry, I just noticed that this is kind of annoying. I'm going to hide this. There we go. The papers written by defenders of MOND offer epistemic reasons in favor of the MOND hypothesis. So why have these arguments failed to get traction in the scientific community, right? If it really is the case that philosophically speaking, MOND is better than dark matter, then why have scientists not caught on with this, right? What's going on here? And there's three possible explanations that you might offer for this mismatch, but between a plethora of philosophical arguments in favor of MOND and the lack of traction in the scientific community. The first is that the majority of physicists is just wrong. I'm sorry to break it to you, but the MOND's appeal to philosophical views and theory confirmation is correct. These philosophical views themselves hold. And so the rest of physics has just missed the point when they're still focusing on dark matter. Now, it goes without saying that this first explanation for the mismatch would take a huge, it's like the burden of evidence on me is like huge, right? It would require me, it would require some extraordinary evidence on my part to defend this claim. And so evidence that I don't have. So I'm gonna say that this is probably implausible, and I'm gonna sort of set aside this view for today. I won't be defending that view. The second possible explanation is that the Mondian appeal to philosophical views and theory confirmation is adequate according to these philosophical views on theory confirmation, but we should actually take this as a lesson for philosophy of science. This actually teaches something about our philosophical views on theory confirmation. Namely, we need to correct them to adjust for this sort of mismatch, right? Or the third option is that the Mondian appeal to philosophical views on theory confirmation just is inadequate, right? They think they've given good arguments appealing to good views on theory confirmation, but in fact, there's problems with their defense. As I mentioned, right, I'm going to take the current situation in science as significant enough evidence to investigate why the MOND side of the debate, which takes up so much space in philosophy of science, has found no traction in the scientific community. And so this means, right, only options 2 and 3 are going to be sort of plausible explanations for the discrepancy. And hopefully now this also explains to the scientists why I'm talking about MOND and why this is primarily aimed at philosophers of science. Because I sort of see this work as a little bit of a course correction to the philosophical literature. Like if you come in knowing nothing about the scientific literature and you just look at the philosophical literature, hopefully this paper can be sort of, or like this work can be a little bit of a course correction that MOND maybe is not a proper rival to dark matter. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. So I think that in fact, I disagree that it's a distinction between models and not between theories. So this is a good question. So there's two ways in which you could cash out this debate, right? You could cash it out as like fundamental disagreement about different theories of gravity, where MOND changes Newton's laws on galaxy scales, and then leaves open that this has to be developed into a further alternative to general relativity in some way or other on cosmological scales. Another option is to say, no, they're not really different theories, they're just models, and they sort of sit independently of theories, and they're just doing different things. And we're just trying to sort of describe the phenomenology on different scales. I think the problem with that view is if you take that view, the arguments that Mondians make don't make sense, because they actively are like, both can't be right? Like they're actively arguing that dark matter is a wrong hypothesis and that lambda CDM needs to be revised. And so that's why I think it doesn't make sense to, or like, that's why I disagree with the characterization of MOND as models, basically. So, now the projector is disagreeing with me. I didn't think this is so controversial. Anyway, I should flag that what's going to follow and what I'm going to talk about for the rest of this talk is largely based on work that I've done with Richard David, who was here a couple of weeks ago in Urbino, from what I gather. It's called MOND and Meta-Empirical Theory Assessment, which is already giving some spoilers away about what's going to follow. But yeah, so it's largely based on this paper. So if you want to look at it, you can find it all there. Okay, so let me spoil what Richard and I argue and what I want to show for the rest of I now realize I never finished this. Okay, sorry. So the first one is the philosophical defense of MOND when taken on its own terms fails. So I'm going to first sort of recap the arguments as they offer them, and then I'm going to show it doesn't work. Second thing that I want to show is that maybe not all hope is lost. We can recast the Mondian defense in a different light. We can recast it in terms of meta-empirical theory assessment, which is a view that Richard has developed in context of string theory, which I will not talk about. But so I'm going to recast their views a little bit, but then I'm going to show the Mondian appeal to MEA still fails. So it's still not going to work out. Even if we recast their arguments, it still doesn't work. And the reason for that is like it's appealing to sort of unfounded criteria, which I'll describe in a second. Important nuance. The rest of this talk does not hinge, or like agreeing or not with what we argue does not hinge on you actually accepting meta-empirical theory assessment. I know that a lot of you may not be familiar with this. I will explain what it is. It's a view on theory confirmation. You don't have to agree with this view on theory confirmation. What you do need to what I do need to convince you of is that the strongest possible defense of MOND uses meta-empirical theory confirmation, right? And given that that's the case, then their arguments still fail. So it's just like an important nuance here that I wanted to flag. So here's what the rest of the talk is going to look like. I'm going to briefly recap the debate between dark matter and MOND, but I'm not going to spend too much time on it because I'm assuming that you've already heard about this yesterday, right? Yes? Okay, good. And then I'm going to talk about the original arguments offered in favor of MOND as they're offered by the defenders of MOND, where they often appeal to Karl Popper's work and Imre Lakatosh's work on theory confirmation. And I'm going to show why it fails, right, when they appeal to these views. Instead, Richard and I propose this, the Mondian defense as an instance of meta-empirical theory assessment. So MEA is meta-empirical theory assessment. It's too long to type it out all the time. But then once again, I'm going to show why it fails. Okay, let's start with a recap of the controversy. So I think I have this funnel in literally every single presentation I ever give. And so now I just do it as a joke almost, no, or like it's important. So dark matter, part of the current concordance model of cosmology, lambda CDM, describes the evolution of the universe, lambda CDM does, over 13.8 billion years. And at the largest scales, lambda CDM is highly successful. But its success depends on its positing the so-called cold dark matter, right? There's multiple lines of evidence for the existence of cold dark matter, ranging from structure formation to the CMB, so the cosmic microwave background, to the bullet cluster, and so on, right? Gravitational lensing events. So we have a lot of these different things. Now, one particular source of evidence that emerged in the 1970s and 1980s is the galaxy rotation curves. I'm going to take some serious historical shortcuts here. If you're interested in a much more accurate history, I recommend you the work of Jaco de Swart, who's written a really great history of dark matter in various papers and his thesis as well. So one of the earlier sources of evidence for the existence of dark matter, right, are Vera Rubin's observations of galaxy rotation curves. And what Vera Rubin measured, right, was the rotational velocity of stars in a galaxy around the center in function of the distance from the galactic center. Here's one of these plots from the 1970s paper. And so what you see, right, is that the further you move from the center, the rotation curve becomes more or less flat. Now, this is unexpected because at galaxy scales, we think Newtonian dynamics holds, but it turns out, and so it's unexpected because we think Newtonian dynamics holds, and we can also determine the luminous matter distribution just based on observations. And so based on these two factors, it was to be expected that the rotation curves would show a decline with increased distance from the galactic center. The fact that they didn't do this, right, that was surprising. One way to account for these anomalous rotation curves is by positing that you have to change your mass distribution, right? So the mass distribution needs to be changed. So that amounts to saying that there is, in addition to the luminous matter, there is dark matter present. right? Today, right, we say galaxies are surrounded by a dark matter halo. And so the presence of this halo can partially explain the flat rotation curves. But this was like a very quick recap of rotation curves. But there were two things that went into the prediction of the declining rotation curves, right? One was the mass distribution. The other was Newtonian dynamics. And so in order to account for the galaxy rotation curves, another option is keep the mass distribution constant, or keep the mass distribution intact, not constant, but like intact, don't change that, but posit that at galactic scales, Newtonian dynamics needs to be changed. This was proposed by Mordechai Milgram in 3 papers from 1983, and Milgram proposed a modification to Newton's laws such that in the high gravitational acceleration regime, Newton's laws as we know them would be recovered, but for the low gravitational acceleration regime, like the outskirts of galaxies, right, they can be modified to recover the galaxy rotation curves. The proposed modifications allowed Milgram and other researchers who were sympathetic to the proposal to predict various correlations on galaxy scales, they claim. These include things like the baryonic Tully-Fisher relationship, the mass discrepancy acceleration relation, and so on. And importantly, right, Milgram and his collaborators also claimed, and like in later decades, researchers on MOND also began to claim that the kinds of correlations that MOND could sort of naturally predict would be very unexpected from the perspective of dark matter, or based on the dark matter hypothesis. So this was sort of like the original sort of debate. Now, the MOND hypothesis has not taken off at all in cosmology. And as I said before, I would wager that the vast majority of cosmologists accept lambda CDM as the only plausible sort of model of the universe, and sort of reject MOND as a plausible alternative, even for just modeling galactic scales. Maybe as a phenomenological model, but not as like a proper explanation of what's going on galactic scales. So here's a quote from Dan Hooper, right? When he gave a Tasi lecture on dark matter, he says, MOND fails to successfully describe the observed features of galaxy clusters. Other evidence, such as the cosmic microwave background and isotropies and large-scale structure, are not generally able to be addressed by MOND, as MOND represents a phenomenological modification of Newtonian dynamics, and thus is not applicable to questions addressed by general relativity, such as the expansion history of the universe. So there's multiple criticisms of MOND in this quote, right? It's like MOND fails to account for observations on galaxy clusters or cosmological scales, observations that the dark matter hypothesis in context of lambda CDM can account for. And there's currently still no broadly accepted relativistic version of MOND that is a version of MOND that's compatible with general relativity. So MOND also doesn't fit with our current best theory of gravity even, right? While dark matter actually does. But as I mentioned in the beginning, right, there's been so many papers in the philosophical literature that about this debate, and many of these actually defend MOND as being better than the dark matter hypothesis. So what is this sort of defense that Mondians give? What is their appeal to philosophy of science, and why does it fail? So I'll briefly stop between each section to see if there's questions, but and then I'll have a longer break later on, but if there's no questions. And also for a water break for me. Okay, seeing none. What's the Mondian appeal to philosophy of science? Why does it fail? Defenders of MOND try to show, on the one hand, that dark matter is unscientific because it is unfalsifiable. And that in contrast, right, so dark matter being unscientific, it's not even that it's a bad theory. It's not even a scientific theory, right? And on the other hand, MOND is scientific and in fact, a progressive, a fruitful research program. And so this implies that MOND should be preferred. So how do they argue this? According to the Mondians, there's two levels at which the dark matter hypothesis is unfalsifiable or unscientific. The first is dark matter is part of lambda CDM. And they claim that lambda CDM is unfalsifiable and therefore unscientific because deriving predictions from lambda CDM relies on complex computer simulations with large amount of free parameters that permit tuning, right? So the simulations that are used to derive predictions from lambda CDM have so many free parameters because they're so complex that the Mondians claim you can basically predict just about anything with them if you want. I will focus on computer simulations in the final lecture, so I won't say too much about it now. But what's important for the current purposes is the following, right? Historically speaking, cosmological simulations have modeled things at the largest scale first, because it's kind of easiest, because that's where gravity is dominant. And so you can ignore all of the other physical processes that complicate things. And then, when you like increase the resolution of your simulation, you can go into smaller scales. But when you go to smaller scales, other physics starts to get important, right? There's a bunch of non-gravitational processes that might become relevant. And so the more of these kinds of processes you include, but even at the larger scales, already you have some free parameters, but the more that like you're including non-linear, non-gravitational physics, like the more that it becomes more free parameters that become available. And so the more tuning there seems to be, the more sort of like tweaking, you can twist a lot of knobs and sort of get the simulation outcome that you want. Here's, for instance, a quote by Merritt from a paper from 2017, where he argues against sort of dark matter being a proper scientific hypothesis. And he says, when attempting to reproduce the rotation curve of an individual galaxy, the parameters describing the putative dark matter halo are typically varied arbitrarily in order to give the best fit to the data. In this limited sense, the dark matter hypothesis can be said to be non-falsifiable, since essentially any observed rotation curve can be fit by adjusting the assumed dark matter density appropriately. And so he's sort of giving an example of how you might tune your simulation so you can get the right output for what you want, right? So that's like the first sort of set of unfalsifiability. There's a second reason that dark matter is unfalsifiable. The first reason focused on lambda CDM, but the second one focused on like dark matter specifically, the dark matter hypothesis itself, the idea that a large proportion of the current energy density of the universe is constituted by a form of non-baryonic dark matter. And the second reason has to do with the fact that what constitutes non-baryonic dark matter is largely an open question, right? There's lots and lots of dark matter candidates that have been proposed. There's lots and lots of experiments that try to find evidence for them. But if scientists if scientists fail to find one of these candidates, that's not really a reason to give up the dark matter hypothesis altogether, because the mass range for possible dark matter candidates is very, very broad. You like hear different figures, but like, you know, it's some of them that you still hear are like 95 orders of magnitude. And so that's huge, right, for a mass range. And so if you just exclude one dark matter candidate, you still have an enormous range of other dark matter candidates that you can propose. And so you don't have to give up the dark matter hypothesis itself. And so the Mondian complaint is that this makes the dark matter hypothesis itself unfalsifiable, because failure to detect any one dark matter candidate does not imply that the dark matter hypothesis itself has been falsified, right? So even if, you know, we fail to find WIMPs, that's never going to be reason to give up dark matter, because we can just switch to axions, for instance, right? And if we don't find axions, then we'll surely find a new dark matter candidate, right? Maybe primordial black holes will come back and things like that, right? So this is the second complaint of unfalsifiability. This is what Stacy McGaugh, for instance, describes in this kind of long quote. He writes, given what we know of cosmology today, non-baryonic dark matter must exist. But does it? We know there must be new physics, but of what kind? The existence of the ether, notice, right? The ether was even more scientific than dark matter. The existence of the ether was at least falsifiable. It is not obvious that CDM, cold dark matter, meets this standard, and we teeter on the brink of the definition of science. The existence of cold dark matter is confirmable. A clear laboratory detection of appropriate WIMPs would suffice. However, the existence of dark matter is not falsifiable. If we fail to find WIMPs, maybe it's axions. If not axions, we are free to invent another form of dark matter, and another, and so on ad infinitum. CDM was invented for very good reasons. But if this hypothesis happens to be wrong, how do we tell? And so notice that these two charges of unfalsifiability sort of hang together, right? The first one makes it seemingly impossible to falsify dark matter at the level of lambda CDM. You might then say, well, maybe, but dark matter in itself is falsifiable if we just focus on the dark matter hypothesis itself. But because of this enormous possibility space for dark matter candidates, right, the second sort of falsifiability potential fails as well. So this is the problem with dark matter. And so but you might say the Mondians want to be fair and say that, look, the unfalsifiability of dark matter, it is redeemable. And the way it is redeemable is if dark matter scientists adopt a specific dark matter candidate, right? And then they stick to it. Then the hypothesis becomes falsifiable. Because if scientists look for the dark matter candidate in that case, and they can't find it, then they have to reject the entire dark matter hypothesis, right? So if scientists just say, okay, it's the lightest supersymmetric partner in this particular supersymmetry model, and that's our dark matter candidate, and they look for it and they can't find it, well, then you got to give up dark matter altogether. But of course, this approach is really unfair, right? Because for dark matter scientists, this is kind of a non-starter. None of the current dark matter candidates have sufficient theoretical or empirical support for being adopted as the dark matter candidate. And so even though scientists may have pragmatic or theoretical reasons to prefer doing research on one candidate over another, none of these reasons constitute sufficient epistemic support to just narrow down the dark matter hypothesis to this like one particular candidate. In fact, it seems that the reasoning, from what I gather in science, is exactly reversed, right? No particle model or no dark matter candidate will be adopted without there being a convincing detection first, right? And so, so this kind of offered route to scientificality for dark matter by the Mondians is like a non-starter, basically. But there's a final part to the Mondian arguments, right? So I've reconstructed sort of the Mondian rejection of dark matter as being unfalsifiable. And sorry, I forgot to mention, this is sort of where they appeal to Karl Popper, who famously claimed that for a hypothesis to be scientific, it has to be possible to prove it wrong. So you have to make very specific predictions, like the hypothesis has to allow very specific predictions, so that if you test those predictions and they don't come true, you have to you can reject your hypothesis, basically. So that's their sort of scientificality criterion. Like in order to be science, it has to be falsifiable. Dark matter fails, so they've rejected dark matter. But what about MOND, right? Because is MOND falsifiable and therefore scientific? It's not entirely obvious, right? Because initially, MOND was also introduced to sort of fix up an anomaly, right? There were these anomalous galaxy rotation curves. And then we just like started wiggling around with Newtonian dynamics. So why is that a proper way of doing science, right? Why is MOND not like, why can't MOND be charged with the same issue of unscientificality, of being sort of an ad hoc modification? Defenders of MOND recognize this concern. But they argue that since their initial introduction, dark matter and MOND have seen very different developments, right? Dark matter has remained sort of in the unfalsifiable because of the reasons that I've just given. But MOND has, according to them, given rise to various risky predictions that have borne out. As such, MOND clears the scientificality bar set by Popper, right? And so the kinds of predictions they have in mind are things like the baryonic Tully-Fisher relationship or the mass discrepancy acceleration relation and things like that, right? All of these kinds of correlations on galaxy scales were predicted by MOND, and then observations were made, and these predictions were, they claim, borne out. So MOND is falsifiable, but has withstood these severe tests. And moreover, defenders of MOND go even further. If we leave behind Popper and go for a slightly more complex view on theories that was proposed by Imre Lakatos, we can say more than MOND just being scientific. So Lakatos famously distinguished between two kinds of, between progressive research programs and degenerative research programs. I won't recap all of Lakatos today. I think Will can probably do that better than me because he also has a paper on this topic. So I won't go through all of this today, but the basic idea is the following, that you can distinguish between research programs depending on as degenerative or progressive, depending on how fruitful they are in generating novel predictions, right? And successful novel predictions. And as the name suggests, right, the generative research programs are not very good at that. They merely accommodate observations, right? So new observations are made. It doesn't fit with the theory. Well, we fiddle around with it a little bit. So now it fits with the theory, but this doesn't give us any new sort of insights. We're not able to predict anything new. Progressive research programs, on the other hand, even if there's something that initially doesn't fit and you make slight modifications, those modifications will actually generate some new insights and new predictions, and you'll learn something new from them. And so what the defenders of MOND claim is that, right, and just sort of to close down the very brief and very informal introduction to Lakatos, the degenerative research programs eventually will sort of die out, right? Because you just can't do anything with them, whereas the progressive ones will continue to grow and change and teach us more about the world. And so what defenders of MOND claim is that MOND is in fact a progressive research program, right? That it started out, the way MOND started out was there were these anomalous rotation curves. They made this one modification to Newtonian dynamics, but from that, a whole new world of correlations on galaxy scales have opened up. Right. And so MOND is, in fact, they think, a progressive research program. It's not just scientific, it's good scientific, right? That's the idea. And so we see this this full quote from Merritt, which I quoted part of earlier, which is that, or maybe I didn't, know that the prediction of the baryonic Tully-Fisher relation of Milgrams is refutable. It could, in principle, have been found to be incorrect. By contrast, the standard model prediction that dark matter particles are passing through an earth-bound laboratory is not refutable, since nothing whatsoever is known about the properties of the putative dark particles. A failure to detect them might simply mean that their cross-section for interaction with normal matter is very small, and that is in fact the explanation that standard model cosmologists currently promote. On these grounds as well, Milgram's hypothesis wins. It is epistemically the preferred explanation. And so MOND is progressive, right? They made these new predictions, and it turns out that these predictions were borne out, whereas dark matter is unfalsifiable, it's not properly scientific. And so in these grounds, Milgram's hypothesis wins. It's epistemically to be preferred, right? So this is the defense that you sort of the conclusion, right, that they draw is MOND is the only viable theory of galactic scale physics, and there's no plausible alternatives to it, and we should therefore increase our trust in the viability of MOND, right? MOND is epistemically preferable, right? So that's at least what defenders of MOND have argued in their philosophy papers. But does it work? It's a question. No, sadly. I mean, I told you. Richard and I think these arguments fail. So for the rest of this talk, let me explain why. And let's start by taking the arguments that are offered by defenders of MOND on their own terms, right? So I've mentioned that they appeal to the work of Popper and they appeal to the work of Lakatos, and they appeal to sort of the original views, right? But if we take the Popperian and Lakatosian views on scientificality and theory change as on their own terms, as good philosophical views, should we indeed accept MOND over dark matter? And Richard and I think that there's actually a mismatch between what the Mondians want to claim and the views of Popper and Lakatos. Defenders of MOND are putting these frameworks to a task that requires more of them than they can offer. So basically, the philosophical views that they're appealing to, the one offered by Popper and the one offered by Lakatos, like don't have the resources to make the kind of epistemic argument that the Mondians want to make, right? They want to make an epistemic case that we should increase our trust in MOND. They use Popper and Lakatos for that, but we don't think that you can use them for that. Why doesn't Popper work? Well, Popper's view about falsifiability, right, was a normative point. The point was scientists are not allowed to construct unfalsifiable theories, but he rejected any kind of epistemic import for theory assessment, right? Popper like rejected any ideas of confirmation, increased trust, any of these kinds of things, right? This was not something that he thought scientists could rely on, given the riddle of induction, for instance. And so according to Popper, Mondians at most can claim dark matter is unfalsifiable, so scientists shouldn't work on it. But they can't claim, while they can continue to work on MOND, but they can't claim dark matter is unfalsifiable, MOND is falsifiable, so MOND is way better confirmed than dark matter. That's just like a claim that they can't claim sort of increased confirmation for MOND separately, right? They can't use Popper for that, basically. That's the idea. Okay, that's the first problem. What about Lakatos? Lakatos, from his point, actually provided a descriptive account. He wasn't making any kind of like normative claims or anything like that. And Lakatos's work was also importantly backward looking. He didn't really think that you can sort of like right now say, this is progressive, this is degenerative. It's only once history has run its course and we look back at previous scientific theories that we can say, oh, this one was degenerative and this one was progressive, but it requires the benefit of hindsight, right? And so he did not give sort of like epistemic norms or implications for ongoing scientific debate. This is sort of a well-known shortcoming of Lakatos's work. Philosophers, since Lakatos has published his work, have tried to sort of modify his views and give these epistemic criteria so that you can intervene in ongoing scientific debates. The problem is Mondians are appealing to original Lakatos and not to these newly developed ideas, right? So it doesn't work from that perspective either. So neither Popper or Lakatos give these kinds of resources for the epistemic claim about trust in a theory that Mondians want to make, right? And so there's this mismatch between the philosophical views that they're using and the sort of claims that they want to make based on these philosophical views. And so given that the defenders of MOND do want to make an epistemic point about which theory is to be trusted or in which theory we should increase our credences, we can't just stick with Popper and Lakatos. We have to find sort of a different view. Because, right, recall this quote. It's epistemically, so Milgram's hypothesis is epistemically the preferred explanation, right? Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, the debate is ongoing, right?
Yeah, but since you could argue that both of them have become generative at least 10 years ago already, then who cares that it's still working?
But I think this is exactly the kind of thing. It's ongoing scientific research, right? I think the kind of cases that Lakatos maybe was thinking about is like Ptolemy versus Copernicus, right? And like that's the kind of hindsight, perhaps. I mean, even like we could argue that maybe it's been long enough, but even then it's like, I don't, like even then you're still stuck with the fact that it's a descriptive claim, right? Even then you might say like, I described this as degenerative and I described this as progressive, but it doesn't tell you that because one or the other, that like, there's like an epistemic sort of like my credence should be increased in one over the other because of the contrast, I think. Yeah.
Area, I would probably argue that on and pretty convincingly you could say to be generating is the historical and relativistic activity.
Sure.
So I mean, we've been building those for 40 years and haven't established like a first ones violate causality, so you people with that and have these weird scalar fields. Then you get the long bending of light. So when you put a Lagrange multiplier in the vector field, then you predict the wrong speed for gravitation for the speed of gravitational waves. Great new theory that's more journalism. Right. So you have a lot of kind of examples of pretty clear predictions that this attempts to construct the relativistic theory of just got tremendously wrong. For decades.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very good point. However, the problem with that is now you've made MOND degenerative, right? And we're trying to create the strongest possible defense of MOND here, right? So then like we're still in trouble from their perspective, right? Yeah.
I think I agree with what you say. Yesterday we were talking about else, right? Like action-like particles. And then also say like in the dark matter case, also modifying things and original. The original was like, oh, go for symmetric width. It's all holding problem. Go for action. It's all from the depot. And now like action line or width line.
But I think that now you're sort of doing the thing that the Mondians are sort of pushing dark matter. And though you're doing it on purpose, I think. But it's like now you're pushing it to be like, well, it has to be one particular candidate, right? Like you're not like you're sort of blocking the option of considering the dark matter hypothesis on its own terms without there being a particular candidate already adopted, with like leaving that as an area for future research.
I guess in its trend, now you get two samples that the original motivations of most of these mainstream candidates, those original motivations are kind of not there anymore and that's not put on the carpet.
Right, but I'm not sure whether the original motivations for the mainstream candidates are not exhaustive of the original motivations for dark matter altogether, I guess is the distinction that I'm sort of trying to make. Antonis, you also had a question.
What is the one appeal to new electrical programs? And then make the case that one is and I assume the way they go through this program is
right. Yeah. Right. Well, so I think this is where Will's point becomes really, so the question is like, I mentioned people have tried to sort of develop Lakatos's views and include these epistemic criteria to sort of be able to intervene in existing debates in science to be like, which one is progressive, which one is degenerative? Can they then make the claim that MOND is still progressive? But I think that's what Will's point was like pointing out, which is like, it turns out, given these searches for relativistic extensions of MOND that keep failing and failing and failing, or like, yeah, it seems that there's like always new candidates that need to be developed, that I'm not sure that they could actually make the case. Yeah. Are there other questions? Okay. So it's 10:02. I suggest, oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead. What's your name? Tobias. Okay.
Let's say in part 5, I would say not false positive, but I see the point of being hard to false, but how can you philosophically make the assumption that whatever the fundamental structure of, well, we could say real reality or our observation, whatever point of view one would adopt, is how do we make the decision that that has to be structured in a way that would be falsifiable if it was wrong? I mean, I know scientific theories like to be falsifiable because, well, that's kind of science works. So what if the fundamental truth happens to be structured in a way that would be hard to not falsify?
There's different ways of understanding what you might mean by falsifiability, but I do think that even though Popper's views were in some senses like too strict and too rigid, there is a sense in which empirical testability is at the heart of scientific research, right? And so there, although you can't necessarily sort of, I mean, if you look at like fundamental physics today, if you look at things like string theory or things like that, it might not be plausible to be like immediate falsifiability is always required, but there at the very least has to be like a promise of empirical testability, right? Like that's just what it means to do science. Now you say like, but what if the real world is, what if really the fundamental structure of the world is such that it's like not testable at all? Well, if that's the case, then we won't uncover it with science. Then it just falls outside of the realm of science, I would say. Yeah. Yeah.
And I would argue that promise of quantifiability is there even for document reversibility, but that's what it is.
Yeah.
If we apply that argument, so not be allowed to do, I don't know, black holes, because we don't know they are there, and we have three parameters, we have the mass, we have the spin, we just see some sort of matter world outside. How do we know that actually there?
Well, I think there's an important distinction here, right? Because in the context of black holes, you have very good theoretical background. And you have a very good sort of like theoretical background to also derive particular predictions from it, right? Like gravitational waves, like the images of the black hole that the NGHT takes, things like that. The charge against dark matter is that you have these simulations that are constructed, and sure, you have some background on like how you implement gravitational interactions, how you implement non-gravitational physics, things like that. But otherwise, it is so unconstrained. And the issue here really is about simulations, right? It's like the fact that you're using numerical simulations just means automatically that there's a ton of free parameters. And that includes things like the resolution at which you're simulating. That's a numerical parameter that can affect your the output of your simulation. And the way you're like stitching together different modules of your simulation often involves like sort of you implementing like an artificial stitching together that also gives you some free parameters. And so the issue here is that like when we're using simulations to derive predictions or to make predictions, we are in like there's some constraints from background theory that we have trust in for separate reasons. But the problem is that in order to implement the simulation, we're getting back a whole amount of freedom in tuning parameters. And so as a result, and so the concern is that like, I can just tune my simulation at will to give the output that I want. And no one can tell me that the way I'm tuning it is wrong because we don't have that many constraints on these numerical parameters. I can just like put them in, sort of. That's the concern. Do you see the distinction? Not necessarily.
What would be an example of something that's fundamentally only, and then for example, you just have the resolution. That's something that is working with different resolutions and see whether there's like a convergence for smaller resolutions, something like that. I really see the parameter in that sense, but more of a helping tool.
But it's a helping tool that will affect the output of your simulation, and it's not always clear what the various effects are. Sorry, Mattia, did you want to jump in? Or
it sounds to me that parameters having different values is just at the level of phenomenological theory.
Yeah.
But that's exactly how the hotspots effect, because you find the value of the parameters, then only a few candidates dark matter can agree with these parameters. Not all candidates dark matter, and it relies on there being viable dark matter candidates. Of course, if the parameters shoot out that there are no viable candidates, then dark matter is falsified.
Wait, I think there's a bit. So I think you're putting these simulations to more than they can achieve right now. So as far as I understand it, and if there are scientists here who want to jump in and correct me, please do. But a lot of the simulations, like they constrain parameter space to dark matter somewhat, in the sense that, well, in order to get like structure formation out, we know that warm dark matter or like hot dark matter doesn't work. And so in that sense, you do get some constraints. But that still, like this 95 orders of magnitude that I was describing is constrained by what our simulations, like what large-scale structure formation simulations have taught us so far, and what like we get from other lines of evidence and stuff. So you still have a very broad range of parameter space for dark matter candidates, right? And so that's like the mass range for, like, is your dark matter candidate a WIMP of like 100 GeV, or is it like a primordial black hole from, I don't know how heavy, I'm not going to say numbers, but like, right, where are you falling on the mass range? So that's a different parameter space than the parameters that I was talking about when I was talking about the simulations. When I'm talking about the simulations, there's things that people talk about. So like I'm talking about the mass resolution. I think force softening is like another kind of, I think so, example that like, you know, these are things where you include them because you have to make the simulation sort of work, but it's like this kind of phenomenological fitting to get the output that you want to achieve, right? And so that's sort of the accusation that they're making, that there's like, we're just, we have observations and we just fit our observations, we fit our simulations to the observations, but we don't always, and we just use the freedom that we get from the fact that we're using these complex simulations to make this work. But it's not that our simulation just gives like one potential prediction. If you tweak these parameters, you can get very different kinds of predictions out of it. That's the idea. Sorry, I think back, Jiseng wants to jump in. Yeah.
Back to your dark matter about this type of black holes. I think the main difference, correct me if I'm naive, is that we know better the experimental power of black hole theory. So in a sense, we know the whole story of how black is formed, but it's not strictly. We don't really know the causal story of how dark matter forms and how it relates to other physical scenarios. And I think that should be the key difference between those two stuff. Because according to your organization, this material, we talk about a lot of this phenomenological stuff. And the key missing here is the causal story.
Mm. That's one way I think of maybe characterizing it. Yeah. Like we have part of the causal story at least, right? Because we know how gravity works and stuff. But the problem is that there's still like a lot of stuff that's still open. Yeah, that's a good point. It's 10. Should we take a break? Does that sound good? Okay, so I've hopefully shown you that the philosophical defense of MOND, when taken on its own terms, fails. So that gets the first point out of the way. But our work isn't done yet, because maybe we can recast the Mondian defense in a different way, right? So can we recast the arguments offered by defenders of MOND such that they do lead to the conclusion that Mondians wanted to lead to, namely that MOND is epistemically preferable? There's a lot of views on theory confirmation in philosophy of science, but one of the dominant ones is Bayesian confirmation. And if you're not familiar with Bayesian confirmation, I will not explain it right now because I don't have time for it. But like one way to think about it is just like strength of empirical evidence, right? And the more empirical support you have, the more confirmed your theory is. Now, Bayesian confirmation is not going to do the work that the Mondians wanted to do, because dark matter is very well supported by a whole bunch of empirical observations. So it's not even clear that MOND would win out in this context, right? But there's a different view on theory confirmation that may help, and this is so-called meta-empirical theory confirmation. And so this is what brings me to this second point. I'm aware that most of you will probably not be familiar with meta-empirical theory assessment, and so I'm going to first introduce the idea of it as they were developed by Richard David in his book and his further papers, and then I'll apply them to MOND. So what is the concept of meta-empirical theory assessment? It's a view on theory assessment that was first introduced to explain why string theory, despite the fact that it lacks direct empirical confirmation, is so successful and dominant, and is considered a viable theory by many scientists. So why is string theory so dominant, even though it's currently impossible to derive empirical predictions from it and to test it, right? According to David, this is because there are certain meta-level observations that give scientists reasons to believe that there are no viable alternatives to string theory within string theory's intended domain. Meta-level here indicates that these observations are not sort of direct empirical predictions derived from the theory, but they're observations about how the theory was developed and what the state of the research field is like. And so the concept of meta-empirical theory assessment, although it was developed in context of string theory, it isn't just restricted to it, Richard thinks. Its meta-empirical theory assessment also applies to cases where there is empirical support for a theory. And in fact, David thinks that certain meta-empirical observations, so observations about the state of the research and like the research field and the theory that are under consideration, that they're in fact essential to generate trust in a scientific theory, even when there is empirical evidence. Because the idea behind it is that these observations are characteristics that you would only expect to be there if there are few or no other viable theories in that intended domain. So given that you have sort of a particular area of research that you want to develop a theory for, right? String theory, like as a fundamental theory of physics. These observations give you reason to believe that aside from the theory that you have, there's not going to be many other ones that can be developed, right? So there's not many alternatives available. And if you believe that there should be a theory for that intended domain, right, for that particular area that you're interested in at all, then the fact that there are very few alternatives available gives you reason to believe that the one theory that has been found is in fact a viable theory. And so this is the epistemic basis for trusting the theory, right? So the idea is like we have a particular area of research that we want to develop a theory for. We have one theory available. And we have reason to believe that there's not going to be many alternatives to that theory. So that gives us reason to trust the initial theory. That's the idea. David identifies 3 different observations that give reason to believe that there are few or no alternatives to a given theory and that the theory one has found is viable. The first one is the no alternatives argument. The idea is very simple. The observation that despite considerable efforts, scientists have not been able to find an alternative theory that can account for the sort of domain that you intended to account for. So this is just like the very first observation. The second one is the argument from unexpected explanatory success. Here, the idea is that the theory is capable of explaining significantly more than what it was introduced for. This can also take the form of a theory making novel predictions. So sometimes a theory makes a novel prediction compared to like what it was introduced to explain. Like for instance, general relativity predicted the existence of gravitational waves. The fact that gravitational waves were observed then confirms general relativity. But the fact that gravitational waves were a novel prediction gives extra confirmation value to general relativity, compared to if general relativity was just accommodating the already existing gravitational waves, right? So the idea is that like, and the reason you get this like extra confirmation value, according to the view from meta-empirical theory assessment, is it gives you more reason to believe that there's not going to be an alternative theory that can do everything that your initial theory was able to do, right? And the final argument is the argument from meta-inductive success. If a theory manages to give grounds for no alternatives argument and for an argument from unexpected explanatory success, and the fact that past theories who have satisfied these arguments were successful in the field of research, that gives reason to trust the given theory. This third one is going to be not important for the rest of this talk. I'm going to focus on these two primarily. So the no alternatives argument, the unexpected explanation argument, the meta-inductive argument, they're all supposed to give you reasons to believe that there's few or no alternative viable theories to a given theory available. Now, you may immediately respond, well, there's easy defeaters for each one of these. And that's true, right? You can easily counter the no alternatives argument by just saying, well, scientists haven't been looking hard enough, or like they're not getting enough funding to look for alternatives, right? Against the argument from unexpected explanatory success, you can easily say, well, the theory isn't tracking a genuine connection, right? These connections are just the result from an unknown, more fundamental theory somehow, right? And so this isn't like a particular thing that like shows that our theory is doing really well. It's just like something from a more fundamental theory that we're tracking right now. An argument for meta-inductive success, you can easily counter with like, sure, past theories that have done these kinds of things have been successful, but the current one that we have, it's a new theory and it's different from the past theories. So those differences might be significant, right? So that's, again, an easy counter to this third argument. But, so sure, there are defeaters, but the idea, according to David, is that these defeaters all have to be different for all of these different arguments, right? And so when 2 or 3 of these arguments can be formulated for a given theory, that actually gives you reason to believe that there are few or no alternatives to a given theory, because you have to appeal to like a bunch of different like defeaters to sort of argue that there's not going to be alternatives to the given theory, right? So this is sort of how meta-empirical theory assessment is supposed to work, right? And the main goal, again, is to argue that there's no few or no alternatives to a given theory, and that gives you reason to believe that there's going to be the current theory that you have is viable. That's the main idea. Yeah. Yeah. Well, so the famous one is string theory. I think, and let me also once again flag, right? I'm just giving you this theory for the purpose of this talk. You don't have to buy this. You just have to buy that this is a view on theory confirmation. That's all, right? I think Richard has another example from atomism. I think that's another sort of example that he has developed. But yeah, I can give you a reference for a paper or something later. The most famous one, the initial one, is string theory. Yeah. Yeah.
I think he also.
That's another option. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That scientists already have good reasons to believe in the existence of the Higgs, and yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's another good example. Oh, yeah.
It's not a fact that string theory doesn't have any dependent confirmation except from this kind of environments.
Yes, right. So, but again, I'm not going to defend my empirical theory assessment here, but just presenting it. Yeah, so in the case of string theory, because there's no empirical confirmation, these are the only grounds that you have for preferring string theory, or for having trust in string theory. Now, Richard recognizes that empirical theory assessment, right? Having empirical evidence is always gonna be better when you have it, right? But even when you have empirical evidence, he thinks you will still rely on some of these arguments to make the further argument for the viability in a theory. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I mean, it's now controlled, okay, so it's natural, now, again, we're going to find the Higgs. But actually, the recently the epistemology did interview people before Higgs dependent data went well. And I mean, by way more, she was the it was people tell it is very now.
All right, I'm gonna cut this short because this is supposed to be a summer school on dark matter and it's my lecture, so I get to do that. But it's also, you can talk about it, yeah, fair enough. There's you can disagree whether or not it applied in the case of the Higgs. I think atomism is a more he's more confident in that one. But anyway, yeah. But are there other questions about meta-empirical theory assessment though, aside from whether or not it applies to the Higgs? Okay. Okay, so Richard and I think that, so as I mentioned just now, right, the goal of meta-empirical theory assessment is establishing that there's few or no viable alternatives to a given theory. And that's reason to then trust the given theory. And so the question is, can we recast the Mondian arguments in terms of meta-empirical theory assessment such that there is in fact this epistemic conclusion that we can draw that we should really trust in MOND and that MOND is a very viable theory, right? That's the question. And so this is what I want to focus on now. And so in context of MOND, Richard and I identify 3 different arguments that fit into the meta-empirical theory assessment framework. There's 2 arguments supporting a no alternatives argument and 1 argument supporting an unexpected explanation or an argument from unexpected explanatory success. Just to clarify, when we say an argument supporting a no alternatives argument, that takes the following form. It's something like the argument gives reason to believe that there's no alternatives to MOND, and then the fact that there's no alternatives to MOND gives you the no alternatives argument. That's just like the structure of like, it's like you need to establish the premise that there are no alternatives to MOND, right? That's the idea. So what do they look like? I'm not sure if we'll see how far, whether I go through all of them or just some of them, but I'll at least go definitely through the first one. So let's look at the first argument supporting an NAA, a no alternatives argument. And so this is our recasting of the arguments that I was talking about before in what we believe to be the strongest possible case for MOND. So what might an argument for an alternatives argument look like? Well, we're obviously faced with an immediate problem, right? MOND has an alternative. There's dark matter. That's why we're here, right? And so any no alternatives argument in favor of MOND has to be based on a claim that some way or other dark matter is inadequate, right? And so earlier I already showed you some hints as to what these arguments may look like when I was discussing sort of the Popperian and Lakatosian points of view. But now we can sort of re-examine these arguments from the perspective of meta-empirical theory assessment. So recasting the Popperian unfalsifiability charge. So defenders of MOND try to show that dark matter cannot be a properly scientific rival to MOND because it's unfalsifiable, both at the level of lambda CDM, right, because of these simulations, and we can disagree with, like, you don't have to, this is just the Mondian claim, right? We're like taking it for granted that they're correct about simulations, even though you might very well disagree with it. So there's like, the dark matter hypothesis is unfalsifiable at the level of lambda CDM and at the level of the dark matter candidates, right? Now, if we accept these 2 arguments that dark matter is unfalsifiable, then we also know that so it can't be a rival theory to MOND at galactic scales, but dark matter is the only available alternative to MOND that has actually been developed. But in fact, we also have reason to believe that dark matter and MOND, in a sense, exhaust the space of possibilities for galactic scales. And the idea is something like the following, right? When you're thinking about rotation curves, you had 2 options to accommodate them: change the mass distribution or change Newtonian dynamics. Dark matter and MOND, like dark matter does one, MOND does the other. So if dark matter is not a viable rival to MOND, then you're actually, you can say more than we have one theory that has been developed. You can actually say, and it's very likely that MOND is the only possible theory on galactic scales. Again, I'm just recasting the Mondian arguments. I'm not saying that they're like plausible, right? So this is like the no alternatives argument, the first no alternatives argument. So excluding dark matter as unscientific, the Mondian can argue that MOND is both the only developed and the only possible theory of galaxy scales. Now, the previous no alternatives argument relies on quite strong claims, right? On falsifiability, or falsifiability as a demarcation criterion, and the assessment that dark matter is in fact unfalsifiable. These are very strong. But there's a second argument supporting a no alternatives argument that's a bit more charitable. And the second argument sort of grants that dark matter is scientific, but it's still not a proper rival to MOND because of how it explains galaxy scale phenomenology. I said earlier, right, that extrapolating cosmic simulations to galactic scales, right, especially to the scales of where MOND is supposed to work, is non-trivial, right? Simulations on cosmic scales can be gravity only, but then when you're zooming in to galaxy scales, you have to like add in a bunch of non-gravitational physics. And in fact, as I will talk about a little bit in the third lecture, when you extrapolate just the simplest simulations to galaxy scales, there's some discrepancies between the simulation output and what is observed. Now, scientists tend to blame the fact that these simulations are not, or like a lot of dark matter defenders tend to say like, well, these gravity-only simulations don't include non-gravitational physics. That's generally recognized to be relevant, right, for galaxy scales. And so you have to include a lot of non-gravitational processes, right? But, you know, then we run into the problem of having all of these new free parameters that have been included and that you get to tune and stuff, even to completely non-physical values sometimes. And so this, according to, so the simulations that do recover galactic scale phenomenology only do so thanks to tuning parameters a lot. And so this, according to the Mondian, implies that even if you can get your simulations to recover what happens on galactic scales to just fit to the observations, Lambda CDM still cannot offer an adequate explanation of galactic scale physics. Right? The explanation that you get out of Lambda CDM is just like, well, I tuned my simulation to fit the observations on galaxy scales, claims the Mondian, right? And so that doesn't constitute a proper rival to MOND as a theory of galactic scales, because in the case of MOND, these kind of galaxy scales observations can be easily derived. They naturally follow from the formalism, and that is a much better explanation. Here's a quote that that McGow gives, right? For the mass discrepancy acceleration relation, for instance, he says, the observed mass discrepancy acceleration relation does not occur naturally in Lambda CDM. Indeed, Lambda CDM makes no clear prediction for individual galaxies. One must resort to model building. The argument then comes down to what constitutes a plausible model. I have spent many years trying to construct plausible Lambda CDM models. I have never published any because none are satisfactory, right? And why don't they work, according to McGow? Well, he describes that too. The failure of the natural Lambda CDM galaxy formation model drives simulators to consider feedback. Feedback in the context of galaxy formation invokes the energy created by baryonic processes like supernovae to rearrange the distribution of mass in model galaxies. This is an inherently chaotic process, so it does not naturally lead to the observed organization. Such models are of necessity highly fine-tuned. Fine-tuning is always possible in dark matter models. There are many free parameters, and we're always free to add more. So I do not doubt that it is possible to mimic the data. The question then becomes whether the real universe operates that way. My fear is that feedback has become a modern version of the epicycle. And so this final point, right, about the modern version of the epicycle really goes back to like our no alternatives argument, right? Because even if dark matter simulations can recover galaxy phenomenology or galactic scale phenomenology, these simulations only can do so by sort of like fine-tuning things and including sort of the modern version of epicycles. So they can't do this in a satisfactory way, right? And so that's like, it's like adding in epicycles in a Ptolemaic model. So that's clearly not satisfactory. So even if dark matter is maybe falsifiable, it still can't constitute a genuine rival to MOND on galactic scales because the explanation that dark matter models can offer for galactic scale physics is just not a satisfactory. And so dark matter doesn't constitute a genuine rival to MOND, even in this more charitable version of a no alternatives argument. Yeah. Yeah.
Not only in the case of dark matter, but also, for example, in the standard model. I mean, there are examples in physics we know quite well, where fine-tuning is actually needed according to most recent experiments, for example, concerning supersymmetry and so on. So I mean, it is not a single case, just at least
Yeah, so this is a good point. And in fact, one of the reasons why you're like, spoiler alert, one of the reasons why we think the second no alternatives argument fails is that it's incredibly hard to make an epistemic case based on fine-tuning. Like fine-tuning in and of itself is already like a very tough basis to make an epistemic argument on. But yeah.
Just so I understand correctly, in the second argument, did they essentially say, yes, lambda CDM is fine on cosmological scales, but we just don't like it on galactic scales? Because as a physicist, that also kind of unsatisfactory.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a fair point to point out. And it seems like, yeah, on cosmological scales, it's successful, but it fails on galactic scales. And probably because it fails on galactic scales, we will have to like reconsider things. I think sort of what's left unsaid is that the idea will probably be that like, we'll have to reinvent our cosmological scale physics eventually because of this sort of problem. Right. Yes, but once again, what I'm trying to do here is build the strongest possible defense. Yeah. No, absolutely. You can definitely make an inverted claim, no alternatives argument for lambda CDM. But you know, I leave it as an exercise to the reader or something like that. Yeah. So do we have an unexpected explanation argument? Well, so the first two were rejecting dark matter as a rival to MOND. The third, the third argument, which is from unexpected explanation, is sort of building up the success of MOND itself. And for this one, we have to recast the Lakatoshian argument about the progressiveness of the Mondian research program. Again, you may have significant doubts about this progressiveness, but you know, I'm setting all of that aside, right? A lot of philosophical arguments in defense of MOND tend to take a similar structure. They give sort of this extensive list of predictions that can be derived from Milgram's proposal. And for each of these predictions, they show that it was a novel, a natural, but unexpected prediction. It was a natural consequence of Milgram's proposal, but Milgram's proposal wasn't introduced for that particular reason. And so then they show that this observation is, or this prediction is corroborated by observation, right? So MOND originally was introduced to explain flat galaxy rotation curves, but since then, many new scaling relations have appeared on galaxy scales that were naturally derived from the Mondian formalisms, and these predictions have been empirically confirmed. And moreover, there's one particular parameter in the Mondian formalism. I think Merritt calls it Milgram's constant, which is A0. And each of these scaling relations allows for a determination of the value of A0. And it turns out that these different correlations all converge on the same value for this parameter, right? And so here's a quote from Merritt as an example. Several of Milgram's successful predictions clearly satisfy both of, so like Leplin's conditions for novelty. This is a particular account of novelty that he appeals to. Information about these observed regularities did not contribute in any way to the formulation of Milgram's theory. Indeed, they were not observationally established until some years after 1983, but they did bore out, right? They did work out. Now, I do have to say something slightly more about this like argument from unexpected explanation, because in order for this argument from unexpected explanation to work, it's necessary, right, again, that novel confirmation gives some additional confirmation value to a hypothesis over and above mere accommodation, right? So it's not just that we don't want just that our theory is consistent with observations. We want to get something more. That's where novel confirmation, the extra value, comes from. And the reason you get that in meta-empirical theory assessment is the following. Suppose that you have a number of scientific problems that need to be solved. If there's only a few viable theories, then it's entirely expected that the viable theory that you have will explain more and predict more than it was initially introduced to explain, right? The scarcity of unconceived alternatives basically enforces that your theory that can be built will solve more than one problem. The fact that you were able to give a theory and it's able to do way more than some of its alternatives gives you, like, that's because there's very few viable theories at the domain that you're trying to account for, right? And so if there are few likely theories, then it's likely that they will predict novel observations beyond what they were introduced to explain. And so in a sense, the fact that MOND makes all of these novel predictions, right? And predictions that converge on this value for this one free parameter gives you reason to believe that there are few viable alternatives at the level on galaxy scales. So I've given you the third instance of a meta-empirical theory assessment argument that Richard and I think we can identify in these Mondian arguments. So do they work? So this has established the second point. Now let's move to the third. Do they work? Are there questions at this point? Notice we're in an interesting situation now, because it seems like we can recast the Mondian arguments in terms of meta-empirical theory assessment. That puts defenders of meta-empirical theory assessment in an interesting spot, right? Because their theory seems to give like reasons to believe that the vast majority of cosmologists and astrophysicists today is wrong because they prefer dark matter over MOND. So if that's the case, like that's an interesting place to be in for defenders of meta-empirical theory assessment, right? It's not an end-all be-all argument against meta-empirical theory assessment, but it at least puts them in a complicated position. Luckily for them, it doesn't work. There's reasons to reject the Mondian implicit appeal to meta-empirical theory assessment. I don't think I'll have time to go through all three, but we'll sort of see how we fare, right? So the first argument was supporting a no alternatives argument by appealing to falsifiability as a scientificality criterion. And so MOND rejects dark matter as an alternative to MOND because dark matter is unfalsifiable. And so based on the fact that dark matter is unfalsifiable, there's no alternatives to MOND. And so we can draw sort of epistemic implications from that according to meta-empirical theory assessment, that MOND is in fact a viable theory. Now, from the perspective of meta-empirical theory assessment, this argument is fine if you give, if you have good reasons that the scientificality condition that you're appealing to, right, the criterion on which you're like letting in rivals or not, is in fact a good one. And what is a good scientificality criterion? Well, you have to have some reason to believe that whatever the viable theory in the intended domain is, that it's going to satisfy the scientificality criterion that you were appealing to, right? So whatever the criterion is that you're using to gatekeep alternatives, like which one you're letting in and which ones you're not letting in, you better have reasons to believe that the one, like the viable theory that you're looking for is going to be let in, right? That's the idea. So is that the case when it comes to falsifiability for theories of galaxy phenomenology? Well, yes and no. There are two versions of falsifiability that Richard and I distinguish in our paper. And we call these absolute and transient unfalsifiability. A theory is absolutely unfalsifiable if that theory merely provides a parametrization of the empirical data within its intended domain without having any predictive import whatsoever. So in that case, the theory, it's just like parameterizing all of the available data in its intended domain, which means that there's really no imaginable empirical data that could, in principle, falsify the theory's predictions, right? And this kind of absolute unfalsifiability criterion is indeed relied on by meta-empirical theory assessment, right? It's like the sort of very basic idea of like you're trying to do science kind of thing. And so it's relied on by meta-empirical theory assessment. But there's a different kind of unfalsifiability, which we call transient unfalsifiability. And a theory is only transiently unfalsifiable if it's currently either not understood well enough, not specific enough, or not constrained enough to derive testable predictions from the theory. But in case of transient unfalsifiability, better understanding of the theory will, or further specifying the theory or further database constraints will actually lead towards a falsifiable theory, right? So that's sort of the difference between the two. Absolute unfalsifiability, there's no way that you're ever getting out of that. Transient, yes, just it takes time to work on the theory. Now, which of these two versions of unfalsifiability applies to dark matter? It seems that most that the Mondians can charge dark matter with, and this is what we were talking about, for instance, in context of the simulations. And also, let me stress that at most, it's not even clear that they can go this far, is that dark matter is transiently unfalsifiable, right? So it's at most transiently unfalsifiable. Neither one of the arguments that I laid out in the previous section actually support a claim of absolute unfalsifiability. With regards to complex simulations, it's entirely true that these simulations are very complex and hard, and there are free parameters, but it doesn't mean that it's impossible to further develop these simulations. This is like an active area of research, and to derive more specific predictions from them, right? And with regards to dark matter candidates, dark particle candidates, for instance, it's entirely possible that at some point there will be some evidence from a collider or a direct detection search or any other kind of, or indirect detection searches that lead scientists to adopt one model over another. And so as the Mondians themselves admit, once a dark matter candidate has been accepted, the hypothesis becomes falsifiable. And this is entirely possible that this will happen in the future. So at most, dark matter can be charged with transient unfalsifiability. But a theory being transiently unfalsifiable, that just tells you something about the current state of the theory, scientists' current understanding of the theory. It doesn't reflect anything about the spectrum of all possible theories. And for meta-empirical theory assessment, we're interested in the spectrum of all possible theories, right? And so we don't get anything from transient unfalsifiability from that. And so this introduction of the scientificality criterion of like transient unfalsifiability as a scientificality criterion by the Mondians, it's basically, they're being overly restrictive. And they have no sort of like reason. And so because it's overly restrictive, we can't use that as a demarcation criterion for meta-empirical theory assessment. And so the Mondian rejection of dark matter hypothesis and this first sort of no alternative argument fails. So that doesn't work. Can we still make a compelling case for MOND based on meta-empirical theory assessment based on the second and third arguments? Well, it's almost 10 to, and I want to leave some time for questions. So I won't go through it in detail, but I will tell you that no, it doesn't work for either one. And so conclusion, but I'm happy to, like, if you want me to go through it, I'm happy to do it, but I want to leave time for questions. So in conclusion, right, just I've given you a flavor of how we actually end up projecting the meta-empirical assessment recasting of the Mondian appeal. And so the conclusion is that the Mondian appeal to meta-empirical theory assessment fails as well because it appeals to unfounded scientificality conditions. All right. So I gonna leave it at that, I think. So I started with this observation that a lot of the philosophical literature actually is advocating for, on dark matter, actually advocates for an alternative called MOND. But this is at odds with the current scientific consensus. But when we looked at the arguments in favor of MOND more clearly, we saw that based on their own terms, these arguments fail, right? Based on appeals to Popper and Lakatos, they fail. I tried to recast them in terms of meta-empirical theory assessment, and we saw that that was possible. And I just went through how we reject the first of these three arguments. We do the same thing for the other two. If you want, you can read the paper about them. And so it turns out that, in fact, even when trying to make the strongest possible defense of MOND, it turns out that the arguments still don't work out. And so the philosophical defense of MOND over dark matter still fails. That's it. Thank you. There we go. And there's David Bowie. Yeah.
Cool. I think it's great. Very clear and I understand the work and that you very interpret the amount of argument in terms of the framework of the MEA and the like argument that in the I think there is a possible way, more radical community can to reject MOND argument, and it's different from the previous current way, because in current way we kind of accept MEA but reject MOND argument in this way. And I think there's the other way to do is to both reject MEA and reject MOND, of course, because I think there's the implicit assumption in MEA framework that you have to accept a kind of criterion of a scientific faculty in the assumption. But if you bring now then bring five arguments into the debate, and then it's very hard to find the criteria for scientific theory. So that's not like solid grounds for the first argument.
Yeah, I mean, so that's a plausible way. It's a bit hard to co-author a paper with the person who invented meta-empirical theory. No, I mean, I see your strategy here, but I think our goal here was to as I mentioned before, right? Like, so I think it's fair enough that's a strategy, but I think that's a very different paper for writing. And in fact, you don't need the MOND case to make that kind of claim, right? You can just like make the rejection of meta-empirical theory assessment.
There are some people.
Right. Right. Yeah. But so this is why I was like, look, you don't have to buy it, right? And the whole point is like, we think this is kind of the only way. It's both the strongest, but also kind of the only way of trying to reformulate these arguments in an epistemic sense. And given that it's the only way and it still doesn't work out, right? It's like we try to be as charitable as possible and it still doesn't work out. That I think is very good reasons to like reject the possibility of this philosophical defense of MOND. Yeah.
Just in case people might misunderstand the approach.
Yeah. That's fair. Yeah. Niels, I saw your hand up. Why are you asking me? You should ask the scientists this. Yeah. From what I gather, there has been some predictions for like subhalo masses and things like that people are like quite interested in. Then again, it's a fair question. I'm not a scientist, but yeah, fair enough. Are there? Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation, Siska. I have a very general question. I agree with you that the MOND program is not easy to find a defense of MOND program on this line that you propose. But my general feeling about this kind of heretic theories in physics is that almost always they are not entertained to the mainstream, but almost always they remind to us that there is a problem. So we can propose an historical example. At the beginning of the 20th century, we found new evidence that there is something strange at the atomic level, radioactivity, Becquerel, and so on and so forth. But we begin to understand what was happening was only after the building of new theory, new models of atoms by Thomson, by Rutherford, by Bohr. So even if MOND is not the new theory that we need, the situation seems a bit similar in the sense that the fact that we are not able to find dark matter and the fact that there is something because the data are very clear is a symptom that we need new theory, not MOND, but a new source. The sort of plan.
Yeah. So I think this is but I think this is a separate question from the question of theory assessment. Because I think, so what I was arguing against, or what Richard and I are arguing against, is the idea that you can use, that like, right now, there's epistemic reasons to prefer MOND as like better confirmed, like more viable, or anything like that over dark matter, right? There's a separate question as to like, should you pursue research into these kinds of theories? And I think you can plausibly separate those out, right? There can be pragmatic reasons to pursue alternatives to the mainstream sometimes, like the things that you described. I'm not sure that it applies necessarily here, but like there can be pragmatic reasons to pursue reasons to the mainstream or like alternatives to the mainstream, exactly because there are certain anomalies that you can't account for, and you just want to explore to see what's possible, right? And I think that's separate from thinking that this alternative may not be epistemically viable necessarily. In fact, I will say one interesting thing about meta-empirical theory assessment that Richard actually points out is that from the perspective of meta-empirical theory assessment, pursuing alternatives is a good thing. Because if you pursue alternatives and they fail, your no alternatives argument actually gets stronger. So if your theory is supported by meta-empirical theory assessment, you probably want to encourage people to research alternatives because it will strengthen the case for your theory. But so that's an example of like pragmatic, like sort of, there are reasons to pursue alternatives, even if you don't think they're necessarily epistemically viable or preferable. Yeah, yeah. Are there any other questions? Yeah.
One more comment about the traditional answer. Usually we say that the traditional answer on plan actually is not that correct because this is depends on the size of the line. And it's not true that you are completely pre-parameter when you think the answer is format. Because there is an even relation that it's empirical because we don't know if it's related to the data situation. It's what described by, for example, the defense evolution on Salucci et al. That was published since 1996, so very old publication, then updated later. So there is a kind of universality in the edge. So it's not completely.
So the modules are being unfair to the.
But also some galaxy information process can explain.
Right. Yeah.
It's not even that there is. It's the MOND explanation is quicker, faster, and easier. But anyway.
Yeah. Good point. Thanks. Yeah. No, that is exactly the kind of, this is sort of an example of an issue with the second no alternatives argument, which was based on like, well, the kinds of explanation you get from dark matter will have to follow from complex simulations that can never be an adequate explanation. Part of why we reject this argument is like, there's no reason, first of all, why simulations can't offer good explanations. Like there's no reason to sort of exclude that, but also maybe it's actually an unfair representation from what I gather from what you're saying now, from what the kinds of explanations are that we could get from dark matter. So it's again, this sort of the criterion that's being applied, the explanatory standards or something are just too strict. And so you can't actually make the case that they might try to make. So thank you. This strengthens my argument.
Second is, there is a work written in 2020 by Grossa et al. About they are trying to fit the Gaia experiment data about the local velocity of the object around the solar system. And they find a very good agreement between the data and what is called the vectorial-driven relativity. So basically they are considering the full general relativity solution, including also the contribution of the energy due to the speed and the tensor, all the contributions. When you start to think, okay, all of them are negligible. This is not true because they try to put all the information from the speed of the object observed, and they get a good agreement between this theory and the data. This is incredibly surprising. But I haven't seen any attempt to explain rotational curves in other galaxies. Maybe this is not possible because actually for the galaxies, 5 galaxies, we cannot know local velocity. Right. But it's really surprising that in the Milky Way, this is perfectly in agreement with the data. I want to see
Yeah.
some update about the study.
Right.
Otherwise, we are talking about what?
Yeah.
We have already the explanation with general.
That's actually, yeah, that's even better. So that's even more strength to it. Yeah. Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you so much. That sounds great. Thanks. So there you go. Even better explanations that we get. Yeah.
So when we're talking about absolute and transient of liability, right? And then you think of, it seems that the case with like any case of MOND very much depend on unfulfilled promises, right? Like advocate advantage. Well, we're going to find a particle, we're going to keep finding it in the morning. Like we're going to come up with a relativistic extension that's finally going to deal with cosmological observables, but the ones we have, we're going to find it. So, do you have any comments on this? To what extent is this symmetric? It seems like both equally hypocritical, like being okay with their own promises, not yet having borne out, and then the other makes promises like that. It's a promise. It's not.
No, I don't think it's symmetric. And I think the reason it's not symmetric is because dark matter is compatible with general relativity and with our current best theories of gravity, which have independently a whole bunch of support for them. And MOND. Well, yeah, but that's the point, right? Like they even though it's in different regimes, like they do have independent empirical support, and there's no reason to think that these theories won't. But there's no reason to think that these theories won't extend to other regimes. And the problem with MOND is that it is manifestly like not compatible with current best theories of gravity, right?
Those dependent nations are in a regime where MOND produces the mutual anyway, so they'll be around disappearing.
Yeah.
That's kind of why.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I've been told to cut this once again short. I apologize. So we'll leave it at that. Yeah, thank you.